Welcome aboard, Professor Segal. A little bit about, I will introduce you. So, Professor Segal is the Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University, and he's also a great Bible scholar. He is the editor of the Hebrew University Bible Project and has written extensively on many biblical issues, among which is textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, late Second Temple period literature. Um, he has an undergraduate degree in math, if memory serves, right?
Correct.
And since then, he has been in the humanities. So he completed his PhD at the Hebrew University with under Professor Tov, Professor Kister, Professor Knoll, all of these great scholars, and he is. He wrote his PhD on the Book of Jubilees, and he is currently writing commentary, a critical commentary for the Anchor Bible Series. And a bit of a personal note, the bit of a story. 13 years ago, I was a student of Professor Segal in course Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Now, in the program I participated, everybody had to take that course. I loved it because I love things like that. But I had a friend who wasn't, super interested in textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the papers, he gives me a call. He says, "Can you send me the paper for Professor Segal's, course?" I said to him, "Listen, we're Israelis. I'll send you the paper, but you should know that the professor deals with textual criticism, which means that he actually focuses on who copied who from whom and what. So you should be very careful what you do with that paper." Lo and behold, after a few days, we get an email, "Come to my office." And let's stop there. It ended up, I'm still here. He is still, but I ended up being on the sharp end of Professor Segal's scholarship. So I know he's a great scholar from personal experience as well. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll talk about the book of Daniel. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I actually don't remember that story. It sounds right, so I'll give you.
Right. Especially since I and the friend, we were like born and raised here in Israel, and there is kind of a notion of collectiveness when it comes to some of the
wisdom.
Right, collective wisdom. I don't know about wisdom, but collectiveness, yeah. Wisdom is, we'll have to check if it was worth anything. Actually, mistakes make it very easy to identify if someone copies from someone. But anyway, I think it was okay. Anyway, so going back, not okay to copy, not okay to cheat, but the work itself. The book of Daniel, the unless you want to say anything about yourself that I forgot, which I obviously forgot.
Everything you said is true, so it was a good introduction. So I thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As Netanel said, I've been I don't remember when you studied, but you said 13 years ago. I guess I've been a full-time faculty member at Hebrew University since 2005, and it's a dream come true to be able to study and research Bible. As he mentioned to you, I'm now the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, which means I have much less time to both to teach and to research at the moment. So it's actually a pleasure to officially take time out to speak to a group because it gives me a break from my administrative duties. So it's a pleasure to be.
Yesterday's guest, Oren Sapir, who took us through a virtual tour of the archaeology of Jerusalem. When I mentioned tomorrow's guest being you, he said he gave me my MA diploma. So there you go. Yeah, he was excited about it. So the book of Daniel, yes, is a special book. First of all, what does it do in Daniel as a prophet? So how come we find it not with the other prophets? That's to begin with. Why is the book of Daniel not part of the prophets if Daniel is a prophet?
Okay, so it's an interesting question, and it's a question clearly asked by a Jewish scholar. as opposed to a Christian scholar. And I say that because in different collections, it's found in different places. In what we have called the Masoretic text, it's found in the writings, right? There's the division of Tanakh to Torah, Nevi'im, and Tuvim. In the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, it's actually found among the prophetic books. The question is, where is Daniel? Is Daniel conceived of as a prophet? Is an interesting question already in antiquity. In the book itself, he's not referred to as a prophet. But for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, when they quote from the book of Daniel, he is referred to as a Navi, as a prophet. Similarly, Josephus, when he talks about Daniel, refers to him as a prophetess, as a prophet. Rabbinic literature had put him in sort of an in-between category. Certain aspects of the revelations or apocalypses, we can talk about apocalypses in a moment, and what's the difference between classical prophecy and apocalypse if we want, whether he was actually a prophet or not. Now, in the Septuagint, we'll put that on the side for a second. Not we'll put it on the side, but just it's clear why the Septuagint puts Daniel with the prophets, because on a phenomenological level, right, in terms of what the content is, it's very similar to the prophetic books that we have in the rest of the Bible. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, and this the presence or its placement in the writings is probably the result of a historical insight which critical scholarship gives us, and that has to do with the date of the composition of the book. The date of the book, if you read Daniel by itself, what the book tells you, so Daniel is presented as either if you want to call him a prophet, an exile, a member of the court during the Babylonian exile, so during the 6th century BCE. But critical scholarship has informed us, especially about the second half of the book, about the apocalypses, that we can date those passages pretty certainly to the 2nd century BCE. The best example of this is in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is this very long apocalypse, and the events there are extremely accurate historically until, everything there is I don't know how much you know about the book of Daniel. From what I see, there's a large percentage of Christian participants here, and actually Christian audiences frequently know Daniel better than Jewish audiences.
I hope I know it as good as they know it is.
I'm not talking about you in particular. I'm talking about I'm not saying. And so chapter 11, which has this very extensive description, first the 4 Persian kings, and then after that these battles between the king of the north and the king of the south.
Melech HaTzafon and Melech Negev, right? Melech HaNegev, right?
Right. So it's not the same king. In other words, there's different kings that go by this title, but from a historical analysis of these apocalypses, they're almost certainly referring to the various sub-kingdoms of the Hellenistic
The
kingdom
diadochs,
in particular.
right?
In particular, the Seleucid Empire is the king of the north, and the Ptolemies are the king of the south. In Egypt, Syria and Egypt, basically. And if Syria is the king of the north and Egypt is the king of the south, and you have Ptolemies, so Israel's right in the center, right? So from
here I thought that Ned Stark is the king of the north, but that's just me probably. Anyway, just to kind of clarify what happens, as Alexander the Great dies, his generals are starting to fight over the empire, and the 2 forces that border Israel are to the north, the Seleucid Empire, and to the south, the Ptolemies, which again, if we've mentioned the Septuagint, they have a role in the shaping of the Septuagint. Again, I was planning to talk about the Septuagint later, but we can get into the Septuagint version of the book of Daniel now if you want, because it's indeed the differences between the Septuagint version of the book of Daniel and the Masoretic text of the book of Daniel are extensive and fascinating.
Yeah, so I just taught a year-long MA seminar on the Septuagint of the book of Daniel. We just finished.
So we have time, no problem.
We have, as I said, we have a whole year. If you want, we can do a year-long course. So first of all, a few preliminary comments. I mean, I really could talk about this for hours if you want, so and it's not like you have to stop me. So first of all, the Greek version of Daniel, we have 2 Greek versions of Daniel. We have what's called what we call in
I
scholarship the
actually
Old
took
Greek.
a course with you about the Septuagint for Daniel. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay, I
Yeah.
apologize. I'm sorry, I'm getting old,
No,
so I
no,
don't.
no, but the other didn't. So go
The
ahead.
others didn't. Okay, so the Old Greek version of Daniel is the original, what we call the original Septuagint. But actually, the vast majority of manuscripts that we have of the Septuagint don't have that translation of Daniel. They have a different translation of Daniel, which is what we refer to as Theodotion, or attributed to a church father, or, well, you can argue about who it is. Somebody named Theodotion. It's not a church father, but there's an argument. But it's not even that historical figure. Now, there are differences, major differences in the Old Greek and Theodotion, and major differences between each of those and the Masoretic text. So just to give a few categories. So one thing that the Old Greek and Theodotion share, as opposed to the Masoretic text, or take one step back, the Masoretic text, or I say the Masoretic text, I mean the Hebrew Aramaic version of the text of Daniel, have 12 chapters. Chapters 1 to 6 are stories about Daniel in the court, and chapters 7 to 12 are the apocalypses. Okay, we can also talk about the language of Aramaic and Hebrew if we want later. Okay, so that's 12.
It's in the page. In the page.
It's in the page. Okay. In the Greek versions, both Greek versions, we actually have 3 extensive passages which are just not found in the Masoretic version or the Rabbinic Bible, whatever term you want to use.
We know the term the Masoretic text. We had several lectures with Professor Tov, so we come prepared.
You come prepared. Okay, so there are 3 extensive editions with an A, ADD editions. And I'm sure you've heard of some of them. Susanna is found only in the Greek and not in the Hebrew Aramaic. Bel and the Dragon, another story. Both of those are stories, additional stories that we just don't have in the Masoretic text. And an additional thing is a prayer of Azaria and the 3 youths, which in the middle of the story of Daniel's 3 companions who are thrown into the furnace in chapter 3, in the middle of the chapter in the Greek versions, both Greek versions, you have extremely long prayers and poems attributed to these 3 youths, just as they're thrown in and just before they are saved by God. And all of these 3, by the way, are very influential in Western literature and arts. You can go to almost any art museum around the world and see a painting of the trial of Susanna, and frequently Bel and the Dragon, but they're not actually in what we would call the Hebrew Bible or the Masoretic text. They're different. So those are differences. I'm not going to go into it. It's even more complicated because even though both Theodotion and Old Greek have these additions, they have different versions of the additions. At least of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. In chapter 3, as a prayer of Azaria and the 3 youths is basically the same in both of them. Okay, so that's one difference between both Greek versions and the Masoretic text. But on top of that, in chapters 4 to 6, which are also stories, 3 different stories. And when I say chapter 4, really the story begins in chapter 3, verse 31. But in those 3 chapters, there are major differences between the Old Greek version and the Masoretic text. And here, in this case, the Masoretic text, or I should say it the other way around, Theodotion, or the translation attributed to Theodotion, aligns with the Masoretic text. Essentially, it corrects the Old Greek version to the Masoretic text. So if you're interested in textual criticism, and as you've heard, I'm very interested in this, and not just details of textual criticism, but a subfield of textual criticism, which has been written about a lot in the past couple of, maybe even 3 decades already, which is in some ways, to my mind, the most interesting part of textual criticism. When the
higher
different versions,
what? What's known as higher criticism.
Right, when the different textual versions contribute to understanding the literary development of the texts themselves. So if you have 2 very different versions of chapter 4, that helps you reconstruct, if you're a critical scholar who's into this, reconstruct the development of the text itself. And then, okay, so those are major differences. And that's the primary reason I mentioned before that we have almost no manuscripts left of the Old Greek version. We have 3 manuscripts left of the Old Greek version, 2 in Greek and 1 in Syriac. But other than that, dozens of manuscripts of the Greek are actually of what people refer to as the Septuagint are really Theodosian. And we have explicit evidence that this is actually by church fathers who were unhappy with his Greek version, which was so different than the official Hebrew text, that they tried to get rid of this problematic version.
So it's very interesting, because here we have kind of a slim version, if you will, in the Masoretic text, and then we have an expansion and a bit of a kind of an attempt to slim it back into a Masoretic-like version of the Septuagint.
Correct. So Theodosian in general is exactly that, is what we'll call a revision towards a proto-Masoretic version of the Book of Daniel. And proto-Masoretic, I don't know how much Professor Tov spoke about this.
Yeah, a lot. We heard proto-Masoretic.
Proto-Masoretic, pre-Samaritan, you've heard all the terms. So proto-Masoretic version of Daniel. I actually have a doctoral student who's almost finished. I actually share the doctoral students with Professor Tov. He's our joint doctoral student.
Oh, David Knoll.
No, he's another one who we share. Daniel Olariu, who's from Romania. He's back in Romania teaching in a seminary there, who's writing about the nature of Theodosian's revision of the Book of Daniel, because there's many interesting processes going on there. And then I'll just mention, on top of that, there are lots of details that are just different in the Old Greek version of the Masoretic text. In other words, it's also just like any other book with interesting textual puzzles and details that the Old Greek, more than Theodosian, once again, because Theodosian is very close to the Masoretic text, but the Old Greek presents us with interesting, very interesting material. I see somebody here posted the Clark Wilson posted the Nets, the New English translation of Septuagint, and if you open there, you'll see there are two columns. I didn't click on it, but if I can visualize it, two parallel columns of OG and Theodosian. Okay, and that's the
right.
So
on top of that, if we already talk about the different versions of Daniel, and your scholarship, which dealt intensively with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have another prayer in the Dead Sea Scrolls that is sometimes attributed to the Book of Daniel, even though it doesn't explicitly attribute itself to it, right? So what about that part of the prayer of Nabuniyad or Nevoni, or
right?
How does it relate to the development of the Book of Daniel, if it relates to it at all?
Okay, so this is a wonderful text. For those who are interested in Qumran numerology is the right word. It's 42242. The prayer of Nabonidus. Nabonidus is not mentioned in either the Masoretic text or the Septuagint of Daniel, but we actually know about a king Nabonidus from Babylonian sources. And in fact, King Nabonidus was the king after Nebuchadnezzar, right? In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, and essentially King Nabonidus was the final king of Babylonia. In Daniel,
right, when Belshazzar serves kind of as a regent.
Exactly.
Right, and some even suggest that when he says to Daniel, "You will be the third in the kingdom," that's because he is the second. So.
Correct. That could be. I'm not sure if I'm convinced by that, but it's possible. So he reigned, just in terms of the years, we're talking about Nabonidus 556 to 539 BCE. Now, what's fascinating about Nabonidus is that we know that from Babylonian sources that have nothing to do, when I say have nothing to do with the Bible, do not know of the Bible, okay? And they talk about Nabonidus disappearing for a 10-year period from the capital and not participating in the annual ceremony, right? So he's gone, he disappears, he leaves civilization. According to the sources, he went, presumably, well, there are all sorts of theories about where he went and why. The texts talk about him going to Tema in southern Iraq, whether it be for religious reasons, economic reasons. That's a question in terms of Babylonian history and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But what's fascinating about it is, for those who know the book of Daniel, if that's the story about Nabonidus, if Nabonidus is the king that disappeared for 7 years or 10 years, Well, that's essentially the story we have about Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. In chapter 4 of the book of Daniel, after he has a vision about a tree being chopped down, etc., because of his hubris, he's forced to live like an animal in the field and to depart from civilization for 7 years until he recognizes the hand of God or the sovereignty of God over the whole world. Many scholars think that the background of Daniel 4 is not King Nebuchadnezzar, but King Nabonidus. And why was it attributed to Nabonidus? Because the biblical authors
To Nebuchadnezzar.
Sorry, why is it to Nebuchadnezzar? Because biblical authors had no idea who this king had little idea who this king Nabonidus was. For them, who was the king? Who was the haughty king? It was Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed the temple.
Right. Great figures gravitate little stories to them, like
That's just
other
one
examples
point
in the
that
Bible.
you said before, when they talk about, some scholars have suggested in chapter 5, when Daniel accuses Belshazzar of acting like his father. So here, some scholars say, well, that's actually a reference back to Nabonidus and not to Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps, once again, perhaps, because it's not clear to me that the story is in historical terms. So you have to be a little bit careful.
Right, and even the word father does not necessarily, in the book of Daniel, means father.
Correct. So as I said, I'm being careful about what I'm claiming or not claiming. Okay, now having said all that, I said that we don't have any sources in the Bible about Nabonidus, and I'm pretty sure we, outside of this text which we're circling back to speak about, I don't think we have Nabonidus in. And I'm thinking of like rabbinic sources. I don't remember Nabonidus appearing in rabbinic sources, but in Qumran we have this fragment which is about a Jewish seer. When I say a seer, some kind of person who I don't want to say magician, but a Jewish interpreter of omens, who comes to visit King Nabanai when he's sick and to help him heal him. It's fragmentary, so you have to be careful, and it's in the form of a prayer. And we the modern title that we get into is Prayer of Nabonidus. Now, it's not exactly like Daniel 4, but it shares a lot of things with Daniel 4. You have a king and you have a Jewish wise man who comes to interpret the omens about him, and the same king has some sickness which this wise man needs to come heal. Now, many scholars, and I'm amongst this, think that you have to read Daniel 4 in light of both the Babylonian sources that I mentioned of Nabonidus disappearing for 10 years, and this 4Q242, this prayer of Nabonidus, which also gives another piece of the puzzle. Right? It's not exactly the same. It's not part of Daniel. Doesn't mention Daniel explicitly. It's not the book of Daniel, but it shows what it is it's an early Jewish tradition about a wise man helping king of Nabonidus, which sort of is I would say, if we're thinking of it as a triangle of sources. You have the book of Daniel 4, you have 4Q242, and you have these Babylonian sources. And I wouldn't say that there's only one way to interpret the dynamic between the sources, but it's certainly, I think, clear that all of these sources are interrelated to one another and are important for, in that sense, 4Q242, I think would actually be a helpful source for the book of Daniel. Not source that necessarily this text was cut up and put into this point, but that the author of Daniel 4 was aware of this tradition which is found in 4Q242.
So under what umbrella would you put a text like the prayer of Nabonidus within Qumran texts?
So within Qumran text, so I would put it under, I wouldn't limit it to Qumran text, but in Second Temple Jewish literature, I would view it as part of what we would call court tales, court narratives, which Daniel 1-6 is obviously good examples of that. Also the book of Esther.
Right, that takes me. Yeah, you already have my page, I think.
Okay, I didn't see your page,
somehow.
But and we have in a story in First Esdras chapters 3-4. You have Nehemiah as a court in the court, and then we have a number of texts from Qumran, many of them fragmentary, but which seem to preserve a similar framework of court tales. And once again, court tales always being about the Jewish exile serving in the court of the as a courtier in the foreign empire. And I think
And
it's
how
part
does
of
that,
this. Yeah,
right?
sorry.
How does that relate to maybe the archetypical story here of Joseph at the court of Pharaoh?
Okay, so you're a good questioner or a good interview. I don't know what the right word is.
Questioning
Moderator.
is not the thing that you know
A
question.
good
Okay.
moderator. So yeah, so this already has been noted, but I've also written extensively about this. But the Joseph, in many ways, serves as the paradigm for these later texts. Now, there are some scholars today, and I am not among them. Some scholars today say, well, if Joseph is the paradigmatic court tale, then they should put that as well as a late text written in the perhaps even in the Hellenistic period. But I don't think that's the case. But it certainly serves as a paradigm for these later cases, and you can show very clearly that both in certain parts of Daniel, in Daniel 1 and Daniel 2 and Daniel 5, even the language used is very dependent. The language and even the stages of the stories are very much dependent on the Joseph story and are intended to associate with Joseph. In Jewish interpretive history, and early Christian as well, but it's very clear in Jewish interpretive history, you once again have this sort of, I would call a triangle of sources, that you have the Joseph story, the Daniel stories, and the Esther story, all in influencing one another in terms of the history of interpretation. Just to give an example, in the book of Esther, it says "V'chelim mikelim shonim," that in this feast hosted by King Achashverosh, he used different vessels. If you go to a synagogue and hear the book of Esther read on
It's very becoming. We're just approaching the 9th of Av, right?
Exactly. Okay, you're right. I should connect it to that. So if you, it's read in the tune of Lamentations. There's a tune, the liturgical tune for reading Lamentations, because there's a rabbinic tradition that Achashverosh used the vessels of the temple and profaned the vessels of the temple in his feast. But clearly, if you know the book of Daniel, you know that that's actually taken, that theme is taken from Daniel 5. But that's just one example. You have going in both directions. Joseph story is influencing Daniel, and Daniel stories even influencing the Joseph story, the interpretation of the Joseph story.
Yes, the vessels also play greatly in the interpretation of the dream, about which you also written extensively, where the Aramaic word is mana, okay, vessel, and then we all remember the inscription mene mene tekelu farsin, and how the interpretation actually exceeds. We should look at the interpretation, not just what is clearly interpreted as counted or numbered, but rather related to the mana, these vessels that are mentioned. And that may be, first of all, do you have any more example linguistic like that, connecting the stories of Joseph and these stories of Daniel and Esther?
Well, it's very easy in the direction of Joseph to Daniel. So first of all,
Right.
I just have to make a comment. And here, once again, I know it's funny that I'm talking to Netanel, my former student, but I'm happy to see that somebody's reading my work, because what you don't understand is he's referring to various insights that I've had at various points. So that's another one. So that's actually a very nice feeling. Do I have other examples of? So in an article that I wrote on Daniel 2. I showed, I'm not the first person to show this, but I showed you that how, well, in Daniel 2, that's the story of Nebuchadnezzar, where he has a dream, calls the wise men from Babylonia, similar to Genesis 41, when Pharaoh has his dream and calls the wise men. But the major difference is that in Daniel 2, the king tells the wise men, I'm not telling you my dream, you have to tell me the dream and the interpretation, right? He steps up the game. He's a super Pharaoh. Or I don't know, Daniel's a super Joseph, we'll see in a moment. But there, the stages of the story follow the Joseph story precisely, literally one stage after the other, except for this one detail, and except for this passage in the middle of the story, which is a prayer. And so in that article, I think I've demonstrated convincingly that prayer has been added. You can show that there are contradictions to the surrounding aspect, but as I said, if you want, I can just sort of off the top of my head The king has a dream. He calls for wise men. First, the foreign wise men can't do it. Then the man of the court remembers there's an exile, a Hebrew or Judean exile who can, calls him in. Quickly, he rushes him in, and then he is able to do it. He says, "It's not me, but the hand of God." As a result of the interpretation, he is both given rewards and promoted over the kingdom. So that's that same
Beautiful.
summary can be told.
We couldn't tell which story that was,
Exactly.
which is beautiful. Nicely done. Now, talking about the Aramaic, okay. The Aramaic, you've mentioned chapter 7 is kind of gluing together the two parts of the book of Daniel as connecting the theme with a language. The first part of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic and is basically prose stories, as you said, about the courtier. And the second half of the book of Daniel is eschatological or apocalyptic. And chapter 7 makes this connection between the two because it's apocalyptic, but it's written in Aramaic. Now, since the book of Daniel has Aramaic part and Hebrew part, many have suggested all kinds of different ideas. It's a little bit like the book of Job, where the language is so difficult. Everyone with a crazy idea, starts with the book of Job. So the book of Daniel having Hebrew and Aramaic was suggested to have been written originally in Aramaic, originally in Hebrew, originally in both languages. What's your take on the language issue of the book of Daniel?
Okay, so it's a very good summary. Basically, everything, all permutations have been suggested, I think. My perspective is that the languages that you see are the languages in which the book was written. The arguments for translation from one language to another, the most interesting arguments are that by H.L. Ginsberg. He wrote this little book in which he claimed that the Hebrew of chapter 1 and chapters 8 to 12, and here we have to be careful also because it's not just really 1, it's 1 through 2, 4a, but okay, that's 1 and chapters 8 to 12.
Right.
Exactly. So he suggested, based on in some very brilliant arguments, actually. Each argument, each example is wonderful, where he said that you have certain strange expressions sometimes in the Hebrew that you can really only understand if you understand the Aramaic behind the Hebrew. And then once you understand once you retrovert the Aramaic to Hebrew, the Hebrew to Aramaic, and then you can suddenly understand the original meaning of the text. And then he surmised as the result of that the the text were originally written in Aramaic and then translated. Most of his examples are from chapter 11, but not exclusively, from the second half of the book. Now, the reason why I'm less convinced of it today, and maybe if we were living, I don't know if we were living, but if we were having this conversation, certainly not over Zoom, but pre-1947, or we don't have to go back before 1947, we can go pre-1990 when or maybe pre-1980. Before we knew
I would have a little bit of a problem having that conversation at that time.
I'd be relatively young if it was pre-1980.
I would be in the minus, right?
Exactly. So one of the things we've learned from texts from Qumran, which we sort of already knew from the evidence is already in the late biblical books already, and books like Ben Sira, but what's confirmed by Qumran text is that the Hebrew of the late Second Temple period. When I say late Second Temple period, I'm saying the second half of the Hellenistic period and Roman period, is very heavily influenced by Aramaic. And when I say heavily influenced, so frequently syntactical structures, expressions are heavily influenced by Aramaic. And why is this the case? Well, this is true if you speak to anybody who's bilingual. I grew up, I'm American originally. I live with, my wife is actually born in South Africa, but grew up in America. Now we live here for 20-something years. And it is, if you think in both languages, so then you frequently end up importing expressions from one language to another. It doesn't mean that you're composing in one language and then it's translated, but this is the way bilingual authors and speakers speak. Just to give an example, my wife researches discourse analysis. in field of education. And she loves this example, or she used to love this example about our kids, and now our kids are older and we've taught them not to say this. But in Hebrew, to let's say you want to leave an object with your friend and say, watch this for me. You say lishmor al, right? To lishmor al this. So that's what they would say. Shmor al.
Keep or guard, right? Literally.
Yeah, right. Keep or guard this for me. And we happen to live in a neighborhood. We live in a Beit Shemesh, which is I don't know how well you guys know Israel. I assume you know the map of Israel. So it happens to have a very large English-speaking population. So there's actually an entire generation in our neighborhood where the parents are
moving from the States to Beit Shemesh is like making half an aliyah.
Half
right?
an aliyah, exactly. So the kids it's actually a fascinating for field research in terms of language acquisition and all sorts of strange linguistic phenomena. But in our neighborhood, if kids, when they would speak in English, would say, save on this. Okay, that was the expression in English when they were speaking in English. Because, once again, they were thinking in Hebrew, and for some reason in their minds, lishmor can also mean to save, I guess. And so they just chose a certain equivalent. So that's just a small example. Almost anybody multilingual, it happens to me all the time. I'm much better than I used to be because I've lived in Israel long enough now, and I speak Hebrew and write Hebrew on a daily basis. But frequently you'll find English syntax in my writing or in my speech, and that's what I think is happening in these chapters of Daniel, which seem to have an Aramaic substratum. I don't think the Aramaic substratum is a textual stage, but I think it has to do with bilingual speakers. And we know that in the land of Israel at the time, but also outside the land of Israel, in the Near East in general, Aramaic was the lingua franca, was the lingua aramaica of the time. After Akkadian came Aramaic. And therefore, it's not surprising at all that after the Babylonian exile, Jews composed compositions in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and in both, right? When the Bible, we have Daniel, we have Ezra, we have this verse in Jeremiah.
Yes, but if we get into that example in the context of Daniel, sometimes we can see Aramaic or Aramaic-like Hebrew being written advertently to create a mimetic effect, or in the case of that verse in Jeremiah, to address the nations. It's intended for the nations, so it is written in the go-to language of the foreign nations, which would be right. Aramaic, as you said. So sometimes we can see a thin Hebrew layer over Aramaic phrases intentionally, right?
So this is a question of sociolinguistics in some ways, right? Is the choice of the language purposeful to express an idea? So in some ways, I think it's actually easier in the book of Ezra. In the book of Ezra, most of the Aramaic sections are
correspondence with it, right.
And there, what we would expect them to be in Aramaic, and we can discuss whether they're authentic archival documents or are they just trying to sound like archival documents, but they're archival documents. In the book of Daniel, it's a little bit, I don't want to say more difficult, but what happens in chapter 2, verse 4, it's as if the author said, okay, let's let the Chaldeans, let the Kasdim speak Aramaic, because that's what they speak, and then forgot to return to Hebrew for 6 chapters. Now, you're right, in chapters 2 to 6, you could say that this is a function of these being court narratives, and specifically court narratives in foreign courts, which is sort of speaking or interacting with the foreign empires. Chapter 7 is a little more difficult because it's already an apocalyptic vision about the end of the empires, although it does refer to these 4 empires followed by a divine 5th empire. I don't know if it's the same argument can be made. Remember that, or I don't know if remember, but be aware that in Qumran we have texts written in Aramaic. Some of them that argument works, some of them it doesn't. We have the book of Enoch, which is a very significant work mostly from the 3rd century BCE, which is in Aramaic. We have the Genesis Apocryphon, which is a rewriting of Genesis in Aramaic. In other words, Aramaic is used for all sorts of things. So it's a question whether it always has as much intent as we like to think it has. Now, having said all of that, well, first of all, I can give you an example of I don't know if I'm saying new enough things or if that makes a difference. I can give you a new word in the
Doesn't make
Hebrew
a difference.
lexicon.
I enjoy it
I can give you
nonetheless, even
a
if I
new
know it.
a suggestion for a new word to the Hebrew lexicon, which has not been noted yet.
Oh,
Which if you want, I don't know if you want that or not, but
oh, sure.
okay. And this goes back to the issue of this Aramaic substratum of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So in the first verse of chapter 2, I don't know if you have texts in front of you or how much you.
We can put it on screen, no problem.
Chapter
So
2,
you
verse
can talk and
1.
I'll put it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Daniel 2, verse 1. Should I wait for it to be on the screen, or is it?
It will take a second.
Okay. This
Opening it
is
in
going to
the
be in
notes.
my commentary. Okay, you're getting a sneak preview of a new idea in the commentary. A lot of just I was told, and Nathaniel said he wanted me to speak about writing commentary. Much of what I plan to be in my commentary I've already published in articles and books, etc. But actually, commentary writing leads to all sorts of other kinds of insights. Okay, so ignore the English for a moment, okay? Because oh, you know what? I have no problem. We can read English. ובשנת 2 למלכות נבוכדנצר חלם נבוכדנצר חלומות. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. It's in the plural. We can discuss if you want why it's in plural. I think that's the influence of the story of Paro in Genesis 41. Vatitpaem rucho ushnato niata alav. Okay, so vatitpaem rucho, his spirit was agitated. This is also an influence of the Joseph story, which that same expression is found in that context. And here I want to discuss the expression ushnato niata alav. Okay, it's translated here of yet he was overcome by sleep. Okay, shnato, understanding shnato shena, meaning sleep. Niata would be a nif'al form of the verb haya, which can mean to be, but also to become. Alav, upon him. So his sleep became upon him. And that's why they translated here, he was overcome by sleep. Now, this is actually a relatively good translation in the sense that it's a good literal translation. But there's a problem with this translation. Anybody, well, the problem is it doesn't fit in the story. Okay, why doesn't it fit in the story?
Because he has dreams already, so.
He had his dreams and now he can't fall, now he's troubled and he can't fall back asleep.
Right.
Okay, so this is it's the opposite effect of what
It should be something that described his insomnia, not his.
Exactly, it's insomnia. So many people, if you look in BHS, I have BHS, the Bibliographica, so they correct the text here. They correct the verb niata to be nadida.
Okay, there you can add it to your Esther Daniel.
Influence. Exactly. Right. So in Esther chapter 6, verse 1, and you have it actually elsewhere in Daniel chapter 6, verse 19. It means his sleep departed, or let's say departed. But presumably, if you correct that, then you also need another preposition, me'alav or something like that. But either way, that's not what the text says. Almost all of the commentators, and here when I say commentators, I'm talking about from early commentators until modern commentators, tried either translate like this and then move on and don't address the problem in the story, or reinterpret the word niata. Reinterpret the verb. It possibly means he was weak. You have a meaning of haya, which can be something to do with weakness or illness. And maybe it means that his sleep was weak upon him. So here somebody's writing the New King James Version, his sleep left him. So that once again is reinterpreting, either they're reading nadida and translating according to the corrected text. It's an emendation, which is being translated. Okay, but what I suggest is in Syriac, Syriac is a very important Eastern dialect of Aramaic, and just remember, biblical Aramaic is essentially Eastern Aramaic. The term shanya means not craziness. That's the wrong word. It means to be crazy, to be insanity, something like craziness or insanity, even paranoia if you want. Okay. Now, if you read that,
Related to being different, like Shinun Yud, as in the book of
yes,
Daniel, Ishtani.
it's related to the expression we have of we have it already in Hebrew. Here, if you want, just to show you my comment, if you want to see my commentary, the text of it, if you're interested, I can show you the text of the commentary. We actually have the both in Hebrew and Akkadian and other Semitic languages, this idea of shinui ta'am, and just give me 1 second.
Right, Vaishano et ta'amo. Yeah, with David's changing his senses.
Changing his demeanor to act crazy, right? That's the to look like he is crazy, and that it's related to that expression, and this is essentially a shortened form of it. But if we translate it that way, I really wanted to show you the commentary, so just give me 1 more second. If you translate the commentary, if you translate the word shnato that way, that it doesn't mean sleep, but it means his insanity.
His sanity, right?
It is that is so he was agitated, and his insanity was upon him, and then he starts doing crazy things. He calls all the wise men and says, if you don't succeed in doing this, if you don't tell me this dream, which he doesn't tell them what it is, then I'm going to kill all of you. This is a sign of somebody who has lost his sanity. And then you don't have to correct the text. You don't have to offer a weak interpretation of the verb haya. This is parallel to vatitpaim. If you're willing, and here, madness, that was the word I used in my translation. And madness came upon him. If you want, I can show you just for a second, only if you're interested, because you want to know about commentary writing. If you're willing to let me share, I can.
Sure, I already made you a co-host.
You already made me host, or co-host, sorry. Share screen. So this is what will appear in the commentary. So here's my translation. Second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams in the plural, and his spirit was disturbed, and madness came upon him. And here, this madness came upon him. So here you have in the textual notes, I discuss every textual version. You have Theodotion, sleep came away from him. The Vulgate, sleep fled from him. The Pshita, his sleep was upon him, which doesn't match the description, etc. And then here in my interpretive comments, I go down here. His spirit was disturbed, madness came upon him. All translations have understood Hebrew shnato as his sleep, but this leads to a difficulty, etc. And here I go through everybody what they've suggested. I'm sorry, more. And this is the here. The translation suggested here reflects a different interpretation of shnato based upon the Syriac shanya, madness or insanity. It's in Sokolov, and it's the same term is used in the Pshita for Samuel. The word can be traced to the Akkadian expression temum or milkum shanu, to change one's mood. Note the to become deranged or insane. Note the Hebrew cognate in 1 Samuel 21:14, which is the verse that you quoted before, right? And the Aramaic in Daniel 5, 6, 9, and 10. And then the suggested interpretation results in a parallel between the sticks in the second half of the verse. Right? Now it's a very nice, I think, a very nice parallelism. So this would be another example of Aramaic influence on, I'm just throwing that out as a little detail, as Aramaic influence or Aramaic substratum of the Hebrew, but not that I think that there was a text that had shnato in Aramaic when it was then translated. But this is the way, this is in the language of, in the mind of the author.
Right, by the way, very interestingly, maybe, obviously, I don't know if connected, historically, probably not connected, but when people refer to someone in post-biblical Hebrew, modern Hebrew, or even before that, as he is meshune, or meshune, okay, or is usually referring to someone who is not mia bil mia, as in Arabic, not 100%.
Okay.
So yeah, that's very common. Like We even have a Meshaneh HaBriyot, where it already
Right.
mentioned in the Mishnah, when you see someone who is extremely different, but
Hmm.
specifically referring to one's senses and one's sanity, one madness, you have Meshuneh, like in
Interesting.
yeah. But I don't know if it's
I
in.
have no idea if it's related. I do know it's in other. I quoted the Akkadian. It happens in other Semitic languages as well. But as I said, I'm pretty certain that it's coming from the Aramaic influence. And also,
Right.
it's
Raphael is mentioning it's the same in Monday. He is Monday.
Mandaic as well.
So,
Yes.
so that's that. We've already seen how to write a critical commentary using a
Okay.
Word document with three
That's
parts.
just one part of it, but that's the.
No, I was kidding. Right, it's the textual part. But how do you go about writing a critical commentary? If you could, kind of few minutes, not
Okay.
the whole.
So just a few minutes. What is a critical commentary? So critical commentary addresses issues of basic exegesis and understanding, but also asks fundamental questions. So first of all, about discussing the different textual versions, which we've done, the history of the language and meaning of the language, but also the history of composition of the text. Now here I'll tell a personal story. So how did I get into writing a commentary on Daniel? So I was a young lecturer at the time. In other words, I had my job already at Hebrew University, but I was pre-tenure at the time. I don't know how many of you know the academic system, but until you
Which
get
means you
once you
still
get
had to work.
I still had to work. I think I still work, but yes, that I still had to work and was nervous about what happens if. Okay, so I had written a book about the Book of Jubilees. I've written extensively about Qumran texts, and here I sound crazy to myself because now I'm the dean. Also, I give people advice all the time, and I give them pronouncements from on high, and I tell them what they have to be worried about, what they don't have to be worried about. But I was worried at the time. I was writing all these different articles on topics. I was worried that I would be accused, and the department which I was a departmental member and where Netanel studied is the Department of Bible. I was worried that somebody would accuse me of not being biblical enough, right? My work is not Bible. It's everything, all these things around Bible, after Bible, all these, and I even got a couple of sarcastic comments like that from various, I'm not going to say which faculty members throughout the years, but different people who said, oh, it's not in the Pentateuch or Ezekiel, then it's not really Bible. Okay, so I have that in the back of my mind, and I said to myself, well, I want to write more biblical articles. So I wrote an article about the book of Azaria, but then I said, what's the closest thing to what I'm working on? And I had written a number of articles on Jubilees. I've written a number of articles on Dead Sea Scrolls. I said, what, Daniel is really, in some ways, the closest. Let me write an article on Daniel. So I started researching Daniel, and I wrote an article on Daniel 2. This is an article that appeared in Vetus Testamentum, and I sent it to John Collins, Professor John Collins. I don't know if you know who Professor John Collins is. He is in some ways the...
You were his postdoctoral student, right?
Correct. He was my postdoctoral host. He's in many ways the patriarch of Daniel studies. His 1993 commentary is my... I argue with his 1993 commentary a lot, but that's because his 1993 commentary in Hermenea is in some ways the sort of still the canonical commentary. So I wrote this. I sent him the article, and he wrote back, "Oh, this is great. I'm going to be in Jerusalem in a month. I want to talk to you." So I said, "Okay." So he's in Jerusalem, and he said, "I have to talk to you. I'm now the editor of the Anchor Bible Series, and I want you to take on Daniel because there was already a commentary in the earlier an earlier version." He was correct that in light of the Qumran discoveries, we know a lot more. In the light of what we know about textual criticism, we know a lot more. And he said, I think you'd be very good at this. So in my youthful hubris, like Nebuchadnezzar or Nabonidus in chapter 4, I immediately said, yes, of course, I will write this commentary. But now I'm going to go back to something I said before, and I know this sounds almost silly. The book of Daniel is not necessarily part of the standard curriculum in Jewish education. And we can discuss why this is the case, but it's much less prominent than it is amongst Christian readers of the Bible. So to be honest, I actually had to go learn the entire book of Daniel really well, and I agreed to write this commentary before I really knew the book very well. But because of that, it led to me starting to write a series of articles. Probably by now, I don't know how to count, 12, 15 articles, including some of them are published in a book that I put out that I published on the book of Daniel. in which each time what I did is I took a passage and I tried to analyze it from, I didn't try to find something new, but I always found something new. Frequently things that led to reinterpreting sort of the entire passage, the entire meaning of the passage. So I have all of that. I would say that I know on all these larger questions now, because of these studies that I wrote, these studies were all written so that I could write this commentary. And I also have a number that are not published because they were given in lectures, and I haven't gotten to, especially now as dean, to adding the footnotes to publish, but I have another 2 or 3 that hopefully will be out in the next year or so. So I know in almost every passage, I can tell you what I want to say, or you can read my articles and you can know what I want to say. What actually is the sort of what's taking time now, and which I don't have time to do because of my administrative responsibilities, is exactly what I showed you now, the verse by verse comment on every word.
Let's see if someone would have to take upon themselves to go textual criticism of the interpretation of Daniel in Michael Segal's work, going through the interpretation and then the preceding papers, and then right.
There is something of that. Sometimes what do you do when you disagree with yourself?
The early Segal, right?
The early Segal. So that's the part that I'm working on, and sometimes I have to be honest, it's frustrating to work on every single word. It's not as fun to have to write something on every word. Sometimes I wish I was like certain medieval Jewish commentators that only wrote about what interested them.
The lemma, whichever lemma they wanted.
Whichever lemma I wanted, exactly. So sometimes I feel that way. On the other hand, so when you write a commentary word by word, it actually forces you to really check whether your ideas work or not. Because frequently the problem with people with large ideas is that they don't actually fit the text. So now when you write, and you have to literally cover all of your bases. I don't mean to say that therefore I'm going to necessarily be right about everything, but at least you have to be internally consistent. And also I would add that, as I said, so I gave you a little tiny insight that I had one day when writing the word by word, because the way my brain works is that I read text until something bothers me, something doesn't make sense. There's nothing that gives me more joy than finding in some commentary, in some article, where they say this text doesn't make any sense, because that means there must be something here to say.
Room for interpretation.
Room for interpretation. So that's my experience writing a commentary. When I finish being dean, hopefully soon, in the near future, not this year, maybe next year, maybe the year after that, I'll hopefully have a sabbatical of a couple of years and be able to finish the commentary soon.
Okay, so we are almost at the hour. Can we open it for a bit of a Q&A?
Sure.
Jerry, go ahead.
My hand was not up first, so you can have.
Okay. So Simon, go ahead. Very nice of you, Jerry. I didn't check whose hand was first, but Simon, go ahead.
I want to hear Jerry.
See how everybody here is so nice. Right.
Thank you. I'll take the prerogative then. In your study of Daniel, what fascinates me, of course, is chapter 12. And I'd like to know what your view is chapter 12 verses, say, 1 through 4, with this actual view of the angel describing and telling Daniel what to do. But it seems like Christianity it hones in on this very strongly. And I just want to know if that is an area that you had difficulty with, or was it pretty easy to interpret that?
You're talking about resurrection that's mentioned there at the end of the people, the righteous coming back to life.
The great prince. I'm talking about the resurrection. I'm talking about shutting up the book. I'm talking about knowledge increasing. I'm talking people running to and fro. There's a whole gambit of things that just kind of mesmerizes a lot of people who study that book.
Right. Okay. So here I interpret those verses in the context of apocalyptic literature in general from this period. I usually refer to it as the Second Temple period. You can refer to it as, as an intertestamental period. You can refer to it as the Hellenistic and Roman periods. But we have both in the what we call the pseudepigrapha, just various works that we have preserved, such as the Book of Enoch, plus in many Qumran texts, plus in the New Testament, we have many texts which deal with eschatology, with the eschaton, with the end time, and many of the themes that you see in these verses are shared in many of these compositions. The idea of the sort of final judgment in which the righteous will live forever, or everybody will come back to life. These for eternal life, and these for eternal damnation. Perhaps I don't know if that's the right translation, but that notion is found in other texts as well. And essentially, it's this: the final judgment is what we call part of the Urzeit, Endzeit model. And what does that mean? That at the end of time, the world will return back to the way it was at the beginning of time. Sort of God resets the clock, and it can be on all sorts. It happens on all sorts of levels. It's a return to some kind of paradise-like existence. It's a time where it's pre-evil, pre-sin, and essentially all will be good. Right? It's a happy ending by saying, erasing everything bad that happened, and we're starting over. So that's very common in both Jewish and early Christian texts, which deal with these questions. There is a question: why are all these people writing about these same kinds of things at this time? Is it because it's a time of tribulation for the various people who are writing, and therefore they're writing in these ways, or is there some other background to it? But that I think is the background to that notion. The idea of the books and the instruction to Daniel about sealing up the books, that I think is a different phenomenon. That I think has to do. This goes back to what I said before. I read the book from a lens as a critical scholar, and by the way, I think the original end of the book of Daniel is chapter 12, verse 4. I think verses 5 to 13 are what an appendix that have been added on. I can give you my reasons for that. But verse 4 tells Daniel to write it and seal it up till a future time. Now, as I said before, I think the book of Daniel, at least the second half of it, was composed in the 2nd century BCE, surrounding Antiochus IV, right? The Antiochus of Hanukkah, the Greek.
Antiochus Epiphanes. Right.
Right, it is Epiphanes, right? But the book itself is written as if it's a 6th century book, right? In other words, it's written as if it's written by a person in the Babylonian exile. So once again, this is with a critical eye. How do you convince readers in the 2nd century why this book appears for the first time if it was written in the 6th century? Well, Daniel was told to write it and seal it up to a future time when this book will be more relevant. And it's more relevant in the 2nd century BCE. So that's
correct. But my point is that the whole book's theme seems to me to be about your people. So chapter 9 is very, very important about the 70 weeks, about your people, about them failing the Mosaic law, going into captivity. So it's all about the people of Israel. So that seems to be the theme to me, rather than any other peoples or nations or tongues. It just seems to be a story of Israel.
So I agree, it's the story of Israel. It is a story of Israel, but if you look at chapter 2 and chapter 7, both the 4 kingdoms there, is the story of Israel within the larger universal geopolitical picture, right? It's Israel amongst the empires, and the struggle, let's say in chapter 10, between Michael. I'm not talking about myself, but Michael, and the Sar Malchut Paras and Sar Malchut Yavan, the heavenly officer or the heavenly representative of Greece and Persia, these sort of heavenly battles that are going on, somehow reflecting the true reality of what's going on the ground. are all an attempt, are all trying to explain to people of Israel, Jews, how to understand their role in this, large world, this world where these empires seem to control everything. But this sort of the true message is that ultimately Israel is, the world is controlled by God through his angel, and this tiny nation is the one who is ultimately able to overcome those empires.
And can we take a last one?
Sure.
Mignonette, go ahead. You have to unmute the mic. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay. At the beginning, you said about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and that he was agitated and so on. My understanding of that time is that he had the dream during the second year of his reign, and he besieged Jerusalem in the third year of his reign. And it wasn't until after he'd taken the princes, Daniel and all these people into captivity, that he wanted the interpretation. And that was when he couldn't sleep, because he remembered that he had a dream that he couldn't remember.
So it's remembering back to something that happened earlier?
Yes, and that is what was agitating him.
Okay, so I'm not. So the reason why I think it's more likely that he was actually agitated by the contents of the dream is that we have very similar language in Genesis.
Yeah.
And I have to find the is it 46?
40.
Yeah, with Pharaoh. I know what you're referring to with Pharaoh and the 7 years, the 14 years, 7 good years and 7. But Pharaoh remembered his dream, but he couldn't.
41:8. After he has the dream about the 7 fat cows and the thin cows and the wheat and the and here once again, as I said, in Pharaoh he actually has multiple dreams. Nebuchadnezzar only has one, but I think the chalomot in the plural about Nebuchadnezzar is a allusion back to actually what happened to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is disturbed about the contents of the dream in Genesis 41 verse 8. So I think it's the same literary pattern here. That Nebuchadnezzar
but it's different.
Because just one, if you think about, just one more thing, if you think about the actual dream, when we actually end up hearing the dream, when we get to verse 30, right? So when you have the dream, right, 29 and on, it's actually a very scary dream. In other words, there's clearly something, and today in the modern conception, dreams since Freud. We're told, or we understand that dreams somehow reflect something about you internally, right? Something about your psyche. In the ancient conception, and certainly both, not just in the Bible, but in the ancient Near East in general, dreams were a form of revelation. We have this throughout the Bible. Dreams are a form of revelation. And, we could discuss, I'm not here to tell you what's right or wrong. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a critical biblical scholar. So I'm just telling you, this is true. That was the ancient belief. Today, psychologists will tell you something else. You decide what you want. But the Nebuchadnezzar wakes up, thinks he's gotten some message, and it's a very scary message. He knows it's something scary. It actually is a terrifying dream. So,
well, what I was thinking about is the length of time since he had the dream to when he was seeking the interpretation. While with Pharaoh, it was different because Pharaoh.
Right. But Ninonet, it doesn't say that he was waiting to get the interpretation.
Yes, but it wasn't until that time that he was seeking the interpretation.
Okay.
I think the simple reading of chapter 2 is that he wakes up and then the story happens. In other words, he wakes up from the dream and then he needs to know the interpretation because he understands God has tried to tell him something. And he needs to know what it means. There is an argument, and here I can show you how you can trace it through an argument between even the Old Greek and Theodotion. It goes back that far. Does he not know the dream? Does he challenge them to tell him the dream because he doesn't remember the dream? And this happens to all of us, where we sometimes wake up and I mean, it happened more when I was a kid, but you'd wake up scared. You don't remember what exactly happened, but you know you had some scary dream, or because he wanted to challenge them, and he knew that if they told him the dream, then they were actually legitimate dream interpreters. That I think is a question, but but when it happened, I think is pretty clear.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Segal, for coming and for sharing both about the book of Daniel and about the writing of a critical commentary. It was an absolute pleasure, and this thing we do here now when we thank our guests. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And it was a complete pleasure. And obviously, whenever you want to come back, you're more than welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and enjoy your studies and appreciate your teacher. Somebody who put so much time into you.
No, I'm right. I'm blushing here. So
the teacher of righteousness.
we'll have to
Thank you.
have you back
That
talking
was
about
awesome.
the Quran. Right.
Thank you very much.
Guys,
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So guys, tomorrow, as I said, we don't meet, and probably Thursday as well. Unfortunately, Thursday I have the memorial for my grandfather, and tomorrow, as I said, well, we also don't meet because I'm celebrating me getting out of quarantine after 14 days. So that's that, and I'll see you next Sunday. Next week we have interesting guests. Not everything is finalized yet, but it's a pleasure always, and I'm happy that you enjoyed today's discussion. Bye-bye, guys.
Thanks, Netanel.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.